Guys, we're going to be talking a little bit about measurement today, and we're going to go through how to measure concepts of interest in political science research and other types of social science research. And then we're going to go into what some of the problems are that we encounter when we try to measure these concepts of interest. And this is a really important section that I hope you'll enjoy. So let's start off with an outline here of what we're going to be doing. Okay, so give me a second. All right, so there we go. So first, this video is going to introduce what the problem of measurement is, and then there's going to be two other videos which talk about three issues related to measurement. And those are conceptual clarity, reliability, and validity. And then we're going to go into what some of the problems with validity are, because it's a really important measurement concept. We're going to give an example, which is taken from the book, basically from chapter 5 on measuring political tolerance. And then we're going to talk a little bit about some of the consequences of poor measurement. All right, so this is again the intro section, and what we want to do is take a step back and think about exactly what we're doing when we're doing social science research, right? And at a very basic level, what we're doing is we're taking a theory that we have, and we're trying to see if that's true, right? So that begs the question, of course, what is a theory? Well, I mean, there's a lot of different explanations for it. The book has certain explanations. I have my own explanations. But I think a good explanation as to what a theory is that it's basically something that posits a causal relationship between two things, right? So does cigarette smoking cause heart disease? Does the coronavirus cause pneumonia, right? These will all be examples of causal statements. Of course, when we're talking about political science research, the extent to which we're talking about causal statements is a little bit more abstract, right? We're interested in things like, does more infrastructure cause lower poverty, right? Do better policies, do better welfare policies cause less poverty, right? These are the kinds of things we're interested in public policy and political science. All right, so that's at the abstract level. We're interested in this kind of cause-effect relationship. And in order to evaluate them, we have to collect some data, right? I mean, that's the whole point of this class, is collecting data, trying to understand what it is to try to understand how to evaluate these causal relationships, right? So to do that, we have to take this abstract principle and we have to bring it down to reality somehow. And the data collection effort is the way of getting to this idea of reality, right? So we're taking an abstract idea, we're bringing it down to reality, we're collecting data, and then we're analyzing it. And the analysis and the data collection, right, all of that kind of allows us to understand what whether a causal relationship is true or not. Okay, so between this abstract causal relationship, this idea of whether X causes Y, and assessing whether it's true, is what's known as this problem of measurement. And the problem of measurement is pretty straightforward. And I think this diagram from figure 1.2 illustrates it very well. The problem of measurement is, how do we go from this causal theory, right, at the higher level, the abstract level, and then measure it in some way that actually gives us answers that conform to reality, okay? So if you look at this diagram closely, we have, at the abstract level, at the higher level, we have the causal theory, and the causal theory is some independent variable, right, the concept, the X variable, whatever you want to call it, linking to a dependent variable, right, affecting some Y variable, some other concept that we're talking about. And then at the bottom of the chart here, we have the measured concepts, right? So the independent variable that we're postulating has to be measured, right? And the dependent variable that we're postulating has to be measured. And operationalization is just a term that people like in social science like to use, which just means, how are you implementing or how are you measuring the concepts that you're interested in studying in the real world, right? So between the causal theory and the measurement is this problem of measurement, right? We have to figure out how to measure things in a way that we're actually measuring the independent variable in an accurate way, and we're measuring the dependent variable in an accurate way. Okay. So this is something I was interested in, and I had worked on as part of my thesis when I was at Berkeley. And the goal of this was to try to understand whether the way that media frames immigrants, whether it could affect people's attitudes on immigration. It seems like kind of obvious that the obvious question would be yes, but in a lot of literature, it's not really clear, right? And I'll explain what this is in a minute, right? So in this particular study, the independent variable was the how an issue was framed by a media source. And so, what do you mean by that? You might be asking. Well, media sources. So these are actually pictures taken from news sources from the Syrian refugee crisis, which occurred a couple of years ago, which was discussed heavily in the media. And one thing I noticed was that certain news sources, more left liberal news sources, would portray Syrian refugees as kind of being something like this, just lots of children. Obviously it's true, right? I mean, it's true that there were lots of children, but it was not only children, right, that you would see who were Syrian refugees. So they would present one side of the picture. They would present children. Now, another way to frame refugees, and this was more what you would see in more moderate kinds of, more moderate kinds of news sources, is that the Syrian refugees were basically families. So here we have a father or someone who's taking care of these two children, holding them, and you can see that these are mostly families, and so this was portraying the Syrian refugees as being just basically family people. Now, on the right side of the political spectrum, if you're anti-immigration, you would probably portray the Syrian refugees in this way, right? The refugees are all of these men who are kind of coming into these countries, and they're really interested in kind of like taking over the country, and they're going to create all this disorder and all this other stuff, right? So these are just three different ways of portraying the same thing. So all children, families, and all men, right? And the goal of this study was to figure out, whether portraying these different whether kind of visual portrayals of these refugees actually change people's opinions. Now, it seems like an obvious thing to ask, but it's really not, and I'll explain why, right? If you're someone who tends to be left-wing, you're going to see mostly pictures, at least in this case, of Syrian refugees as children or as kind of families and so on, right? So how do we know whether the images themselves affected your opinion on immigration? We don't, right? Because the news sources are catering to your ideological proclivities, right? And the same thing holds with the right-wing, quote-unquote right-wing picture, right? If you already believe immigration is bad, and you read something like Breitbart, which I think this is where the picture was taken, I'm not 100% sure, then what you'll find is that obviously people who already don't like immigration and read Breitbart are going to be anti-immigrant. So if you just compare people who read news sources and see this picture with the people who read liberal news sources and see this picture, with the people who read the conservative news sources and see this picture, I mean, obviously, like, the people who see this picture are going to be anti-immigrant, whereas the people who tend to see this picture are not going to be pro-immigrant. And of course, that's only because of selection, right? We've talked about selection in the past, and people select into different news sources, and so they select on the basis of their immigration preferences. So the goal of the study is to use an experiment, which I had talked about earlier on in the semester, to figure out, well, okay, remember what I said an experiment does is that it does not allow people to select into news sources, right? So the experiment basically, takes these images and randomly shows people one of these three images. So in other words, I'm controlling the selection process, and then we ask them questions about, or ask them questions about the extent to which they oppose or favor immigration. Okay, so all this is to say that this is basically what I'm talking about when I talk about the independent variable, right? So the independent variable is how an issue is framed by the media source. Okay, the dependent variable is public opinion about immigration, right? And so again, at the higher level, we're talking about, to get back to our point about this measurement concept. At the higher level, we're talking about the independent variable being whether media framing, right, affects some outcome, which is people's opinions about immigration. At the lower level, we're talking about how do we measure this, right? So the measurement of the independent variable x was showing people each of these three pictures, right? Randomly manipulating these three pictures. So that's the operationalization of x. And then the operationalization of y, right, whether people's opinion changes on immigration, is some question which asks, what is your opinion on immigration, right? So you go back to these photos. So when you do this experiment, you either see this photo, or this photo, and then there's like some description about the Syrian refugee crisis, and then the dependent variable is whether is your actual opinion on immigration, right? So do you favor, or do you support, or do you not support increases in immigration, or do you support the immigration of Syrian refugees, and so on and so forth, right? So you can see clearly that again, we have this higher level variables that are connected to lower level variables through this concept of measurement. Now, the way I'm measuring this could be right or it could be wrong, right? These photos might not do a good job of framing different ways in which immigrants are portrayed, or they might be a little too over the top. Right? There's all these different kinds of measurement problems, which we're going to talk about a little towards the middle of this lecture with other videos. Okay, so you could kind of obviously see what the disconnect is here, right? I mean, I guess it's a little bit less obvious here, but again, the problem of measurement is really taking abstract concepts, right? Again, in my case here, it's media framing, and as the abstract causal concept is what's the effect of media framing on some dependent variable, which is public opinion about immigration, and then kind of shoving it into this measurement box, this empirical means of answering the question, the causal question, right? And so the disconnect between those is what is the measurement problem, okay? And what we're going to be talking about in the other two videos that I'm going to be producing for this is three issues of measurement. Those are conceptual clarity, reliability, and validity. And so we're gonna talk about that in a minute.